So let's create some new components and break up this one relatively big app component into smaller components. Therefore, as a first step, we need to create some new components, and that's why I opened up my terminal here, and I'll create those new components with help of the Angular CLI. So by running the ng-gc command to create new components. Of course, alternatively, you could also create all those files manually. Now, which components do we need here? Well, as mentioned before, we need a header component. And I'll add skip-tests to make sure that those test files aren't created. So that's the first component I want to create. In addition, I now want to create my dashboard item components. So I'll repeat this command, and I now don't want to create a dashboard-item component, though we will create such a component a little bit later. But for the moment, I instead want to create those specific dashboard item components I need here. So one for the server status, one for the traffic, and one for the tickets. Therefore, I'll start by creating a server-status component, though I want to store that in a dashboard subfolder so that those dashboard-specific components are all in the same folder. That, of course, is not needed technically, but organizing your components and your code like this can make it a bit easier to work on this application as it's getting more complex and as more and more components might be added. So I'll prefix my component here with dashboard/, which will tell Angular that it should put this new component into the dashboard folder. So by running this command, I get this dashboard folder, and in that dashboard folder, I have the server status folder, which contains the server status component files. Now that's of course not the only dashboard related component. Instead, as a next step, I also want to add my traffic component, also in that dashboard folder by running this command. So now this dashboard folder has two subfolders. And now last but not least, I also want to create that tickets component. So these are my four new components, and now we can grab the code from the app component HTML file and migrate it into those component template files. And I'll start with the header. We can simply grab this header markup and cut it from the app component HTML file and go to the header component HTML file and put our code here. In the header component TypeScript file, we don't need to change anything at the moment. We can leave that as it is. But back in the app component HTML file, we can and should now bring in our newly created header component by using the component tag. So app-header, like this, written as a self-closing tag here since we don't have any content between the opening and closing tags. And of course, the tag we use here is the tag that's specified here in the selector. So that's the first component migrated. Of course, at the moment, app-header is not known to the app component though. So to make it available here, we should go to the app component TypeScript file and there add this imports array where we then import the header component. And for that, you then also must add this import path at the top of the file. With that, if you save everything and you reload, this application should work just as it did before, but now the header was migrated into a separate component. Now, of course, that wasn't all though. In the app component HTML file, I now also want to migrate my dashboard items. And therefore, I'll grab this first article, which is about the server status, this made up server status, and I'll cut that and then bring that over into this server-status component HTML file. Now this HTML file does actually refer to some property that was set up in the app component TypeScript file. This current status property, which later at some point will also be dynamic and will change. So in order to make this server status component work, we should also cut this current status property from the app component TypeScript file and bring it over into the server status component, so into this class here. By doing that, this component can again use this current status property. Now, as a next step in the app component HTML file, we should use this app-server-status component we just migrated between those dashboard item divs. And of course, just as before, you must make sure that in the app component TypeScript file and there in the component decorator, you make that server status component available by adding it to this imports array and by adding this import path at the top of the file. Next, we can migrate this traffic dashboard item. So I'll grab this article, cut it, and bring that over into my traffic component HTML file. Now here I'm also referencing some data that was previously stored in the app component class. So we should grab that dummy traffic data and this max traffic property and cut it from the app component and instead migrate it into the traffic component class. Like this. Of course, now back in the app component HTML file, we have to use this app-traffic component. And of course, also like before, in the app component TypeScript file, this traffic component must be added here to this imports array. With that, we're almost done in the app component HTML file. Now, as a last step, I want to migrate this unfinished tickets component. So grab that markup and migrate that into the tickets component HTML file, like this. Here I'm not using any data, so nothing else needs to be migrated. But of course, back in the app component, we should now use app-tickets here. And then also go to the app component decorator and just as before with all the other components, make the tickets component available in here. Also by adding this import. Great, with that everything has been migrated. Now if you go back to your application and you reload it, it should still work as it did before. You should still see the same content as before, but now we split up that app component into 4 separate components. And therefore we now have a much leaner app component template, and we therefore overall improved this application's structure and possibly made it a bit easier to work on that, especially as that application might grow in complexity in the future. So we did now break up this app component here into multiple smaller components. But we can break it up even more, or we can use even more components here. Because the idea behind components is not just that you can break up complex markup into simpler markup building blocks, but the idea behind components is also that you can build reusable building blocks. And whenever you have some kind of code duplication, either logic duplication in the component TypeScript files or markup duplication, there is an opportunity to create another shared component. You of course don't have to use that opportunity, but you should at least consider it. And here for the components we just created, we can see that we, for example, get this div here with the class dashboard-item that is repeated for all those components. In addition, inside of those components we created, we also have a similar pattern. We always have an article with a header, where the header always has an image and an h2 tag, and then we have the actual component content that differs from component to component below that header. I mean, the content in the header also differs. We have different titles and different images after all, but the general shape is always the same. And this therefore gives us another opportunity to create a shared reused component, and I'll grab that opportunity. Therefore, what I'll do here is I'll generate another component, and I want to generate it inside of that dashboard folder here, since it belongs to that dashboard area of this application. And I'll name it dashboard-item, because I plan on creating a wrapper component that will wrap those specific dashboard item components so that we can reuse that shared structure. Therefore, I'll create this new component, the dashboard item component. And with it created inside of that component, I want to share this article header markup here, and I also want to share this div with the class dashboard item. So I'll actually start with that. I'll copy that and go to the dashboard item component HTML file and paste in that div that has that dashboard item class. And then inside of that div, I want to copy that structure, though we'll of course adjust it. So I'll copy such an article, for example, from the server status component HTML file. I'll copy all the markup from there and paste it here into the dashboard item component HTML file, but I will remove that div here that contains the actual component specific content. So the content that is specific to the server status, for example. So that just this shared markup is kept here. Now, with that, we of course also need to make some adjustments though. Because of course I now want to reuse that dashboard item component such that I can wrap my server status, my tickets, and my traffic components with it. And in order to do that, this dashboard item component must become a bit more configurable, and that's therefore what we'll work on next.